Good evening, and welcome to the latest in our series of events geared toward helping you build resilience and connection in a very anxious moment. Brought to you by My Jewish Learning in Kveller with the support of UJA-Federation of New York. My name is Andrew Silow-Carroll. I'm the editor-at-large of 70 Faces Media, which is the parent company of New York Jewish Week, the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, as well as My Jewish Learning and Kveller. Our guest tonight is an award-winning poet and a practicing psychiatrist whose work bridges the emotional landscapes of medicine, memory, and cultural heritage. Dr. Owen Lewis is professor of psychiatry at Columbia University. He has devoted his career to the healing arts, both in the clinical realm and through the evocative power of poetry. As a poet, his voice is deeply shaped by his Jewish heritage and the legacy of 20th century Jewish experience, including themes of exile, family, trauma, and in his latest book, A Prayer of Six Wings, the events of October 7th and the extremely difficult months that followed, both here and in Israel. His collections, which include Marriage Map, excuse me, and Best Man, they've been praised for their sensitivity, lyrical insight, emotional clarity. His poetry often navigates the intergenerational echoes of the Holocaust, the complexities of identity, and the enduring strength of Jewish cultural life. And as a clinical professor of psychiatry, Owen Lewis now teaches narrative medicine, which I hope we get a chance to talk about, in the Department of Medical Humanities and Ethics, showing doctors how to listen, how to hear, how to connect. So we're going to start. I'm going to, Dr. Lewis is going to join us. He's going to talk for a few minutes, read some poems from his new book, and we'll get into a conversation about resilience, poetry, and culture and how the three come together. And at one point, we're going to encourage your questions as well, which you'll put in the chat. But I'll remind you as we get close to that. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Owen Lewis.
Andy, thank you very much for having me. And thank you, My Jewish Learning, for this program. I thought I would begin by saying just a few words about how the writing of this book was launched, A Prayer of Six Wings. I don't know any Jew who was not deeply, deeply affected by the events of October 7th. I mean, the world was affected. But what made it so difficult for so many of us was the way in which this Shoah-like tragedy suddenly turned against us. And within a few days, within a day or so, on my corner, I lived just a block from 79th and Broadway in New York. It seemed the epicenter of where all the posters of the hostages were displayed. And every morning, every night, someone would come, bands of people, I later learned, would rip them down, deface them, and you'd see the hostages in shreds on the sidewalk. And, a valiant group of people put the posters back. So that was quite disconcerting. I also have to mention that one of my children and now three grandchildren live in Israel. And while my daughter and her family came very briefly, and I'll read about that, returned to Israel very much with a sense of mission. And so, of course, that weighed on me. I'll say a little bit about what specifically drew me into the writing of this and read a couple of the poems. Then there was the whole world of writers turning against Israel. And as of a few months ago, there was a letter in the Times, 2,000 writers refusing to have anything to do with the cultural institutions of Israel. And I thought, my God, what where's this coming from? If there any institutions that would support criticism of the current government of Israel, it would be the cultural institutions. And how do writers say, I won't read about things? And then, of course, a year ago, last spring, the encampments, which were so um, jarring at Columbia. Now, I teach up at the medical center, and I have to say things remain quite peaceful, but occasionally I do have meetings on the campus. And, attempting to go to a meeting without fully being aware of what was going on the campus was and confronting signs that said, send the Jews back to Poland, or it was almost indescribable. So this sense of alienation um, really launched me into the writing of the book. Um, I thought I'll tell you about the first couple of poems. Um, I got the line for the opening poem, and the opening poem is called "My Partisan Grief." Um, and I got the line early as we learned that the daughter of a cousin of my wife was at the festival. She did manage to escape, but that gave me the in a sense the opening line, and I'll read the opening poem, My Partisan Grief, Supernova, October 7th, 2023. These are my cousins. I don't know them. These my sons, daughters, young lovers and friends. I don't know them. Their music fills the desert sky. They dance to wed the Negev night. Before dawn, the stars have fled, those watchful stars like angel eyes. Who silenced you, angels? You've lost your song. The light is old and bitter, breaks the dark. These sudden sparks start at a rifle's mouth, mouth to mouth, silenced. What unsilenced rage wrangles through ranging hearts, not glinted stars, these quicker knives, quickening life exits. What music now, here in the vast and unmoving desert, these vast and unmoving rocks, this vast and unforgiving grief. My cousins, my sons, my daughters. And then one of the first images that I think haunted many of us was the image of the young woman by the name of Noah Argamani, who was thrown onto a Hamas motorcycle and taken off. And there was a sense of her reaching out, and as media does, they play the scene again and again and again, as if seeing it once weren't traumatizing enough. Um, and so the next poem, which begins at home, called At Home Coliseum, New York. The TV's looping on a 26-year-old woman named Noah as she's thrown onto a motorbike straddle. She reaches into my living room. I almost take her hand again and again. Our fingers almost touch. Now, what made this especially haunting is my granddaughter, who was 4 at the time, now 5, is named Noah. So the second part of this poem continues. In my living room, Noah, almost 4, is looking under the couch for the lion. She's my granddaughter and shapes my fingers into a cage enclosing the lion. She passes her hand over its head like a blessing, declares it asleep, safe for me to open the cage. TV off, we play in front of its dark stare, sitting on a couch that sits on a rug on a floor over a basement, and below that, labyrinths of somewhere catacombs, tunnels where the dead and the living plot. We play finger games, cat and mouse, and pigs going to some market or churches and steeples and open the doors to all the praying peoples. So many languages, we must be in the midst of Babel's ruin. No one hears the other's prayer. I hold up my index finger to ask for a moment of silence. Noah takes a quick breath, looks at me, expecting an explanation. I'm thinking, in Hebrew, the index is the teacher. Words failing. My Noah, this Noah, rests her head on my lap, the lion on hers. I wait for the lesson of these days, or more than a lesson, for all days, all generations, if there are to be generations for all. And as if the name moving from a cousin to Noah weren't enough, if you recall the first hostage who was released, Yocheved Lifshitz, and the third poem, I won't read the entire poem, Yocheved Lifshitz, 85, released by Hamas, reported, New York Times, October 24th, 2023. And here's why that name so grabbed me. Excuse me for stepping into your story, but your married name I couldn't ignore. My namesake, Oscar Lifshitz, came from Kurganov near Minsk. So this was my family name, not Lewis in Minsk, but Lifshitz. So yet again, these names seem to call to me. Um, part very quickly, um, my daughter and her family came for a very brief period of time, and my daughter's a violinist, plays in the Israeli Opera Orchestra. And the minute her orchestra got back to work, she said, I have to go back. This is what I can do to contribute to Israel, to hold the country together. And so in a sense, I was terribly frightened over, of course, the next year at least, um, but also very proud of her. And so here's a poem to her return to Israel. And on this note of resilience, I think the art, certainly for me, the writing of this book, was my resilience in a very hard year. And I think my daughter's playing and her work with the orchestra was another part of Israeli resilience. And I'll read this poem. A belief in order. My daughter returns to bring music to a stunned country, her orchestra straining in every note, still echoing halls once overfilled, once Beethoven's timpanied fifth. I wanted to tell her, stay in New York. She knew all I didn't say. If I hear missiles, she stays in their midst to rally the percussion, the clear voices of a congregation of horns, flutes, luring frightened hoopoes back to the singing banyans, dreaming doves to the date palms, the strings full timbre seeking the autumn garden's blue muscari, the field scented white saffron crocus. Their necessary music that heals, even as it anticipates the wounds. Um, something else I tried to do in the book is sort of capture little snippets of conversation that were part of getting through that first year. So here's a poem overheard in a New York restaurant. I can't talk about Israel tonight. I know. I can't not talk about Israel tonight. I know. Can we talk about here? Sure. Let's try to talk about here. And another snippet of a conversation called 5 Minutes in Tel Aviv. Dad, just give me a few. I'll call you back in 5. There's a siren. I need to find a safe room. Um, there's so many other poems I could read. I mean, one thing that I found in the writing of this book was um, moving somewhat more into Jewish sources and moving beyond partisan grief, which I still feel to this day, but to a grief that is for this entire war that is still going on. So I'll conclude just reading before we start to talk a little bit more about any questions that you may have. A poem called 2,000 Pound Bombs Drop, reported New York Times, December 22nd, 2023. In Khan Yunis, the call to prayer is the call of a dazed Palestinian child crying Baba, standing at the brim of a cavernous pit of rubble, biting his knuckles. Baba, Baba. It's so close to the Abba of the dazed Israeli children of Be'eri, Kfar Aza. There is no comfort. From his uncles, he's heard the calls for revenge, for his home and school, for his bed of nighttime stories, for his Nana's whisper songs of God's many names, his Allah, his neighbor's Adonai, cry the same tears for death and shun more blood. No miracle these waters turning red, who called forth the fleets of avenging angels? By viral post, Jewish plagues on Gaza? A firstborn lost, then a second, and a third. What other plagues pass over? Hail from the tepid sky, from on high it falls and keeps falling. Though we've seen terrible things, will you tell us, Adonai, Allah, tell us, do you remember the forgotten promise? From the pile once home of rubble stone, a father's hand reaching out, Baba, Abba, crushed by the load. We know the silence of the lost child. God has injured us, but will bind up our wounds. Mothers look for us, called by the name Yama, calling the name Imma, our Father of mercy, not the God of sacrifice. Our many crying heads explode.
Thank you, Dr. Lewis. That was it was so moving. Someone I just should tell you that we had a comment that said, I would love to share that last poem with my congregation. So we'll include in the link how to get the book and I think that speaks to the compassion I think a lot of our viewers want to hear on both sides. I want to ask you, having heard your poems, having read your poems, to go a little deeper into how narrative, how stories can help the rest of us. Not everyone here is a poet, but we all have stories to tell. How does story help you as an individual and also as a practitioner get people to help people build resilience to get past the trauma of so much that's going on in the world right now?
Whatever is traumatizing to us, I think, becomes 1,000-fold more traumatizing when that trauma is silenced. Children, um, and my work as a psychiatrist, I'm a psychiatrist for adults, but also a child psychiatrist. Children who are um, violated, children who are abused, but told with various kinds of threats not to tell. It's the not telling that winds up being so much more traumatizing. I have one poem in the collection about the hostage children returning, and I tried to recreate the language, the halting, faltering language when something hasn't been allowed to be expressed. And I think to some extent, our trauma as a Jewish people in this year was being told your Jewish grief doesn't really count. Israeli grief doesn't count. That we were somewhat stigmatized as the aggressors. Um, and yes, of course, Israel has been an aggressor, but has also, this whole thing begins as on the attack, as we know. So whether it's right or wrong, the fact that Jewish and Israeli grief in so many areas of this country, on universities, in a lot of the artistic world, was silenced. And so I think storytelling allows people to break that silence, and it's being alone with grief that is most shattering. And stories, poems, music, art, it has a way of connecting us, not just on a logical level, but on an emotional level.
Hmm. You have a poem where it's a snippet of conversation, but the one of the interlocutors actually says, "I can't talk about Israel tonight.
Right,
I can't not talk about
right,
Israel tonight." And I
right,
think that's a great summation of kind of the silencing, but the need to talk that a lot
right,
of people have felt.
right.
I
And I
just
think we all
interviewed.
struggled, that we all struggled with that, especially if we were, in parts of society that tried to engage, more broadly than just a more insular Jewish community. And it was very painful.
Right. I interviewed this week two trauma specialists who's written a paper that has gotten a lot of I hate to call it popularity, but they use the term traumatic invalidation, which I think
Yes.
is exactly what you're talking about, which is people say you have no right to your pain, you're the aggressor, or anti-Semitism, you're overreacting. And
Well, and even beyond that, I attend it's called the Association of Writers and Writing Programs, AWP. It's a large organization of writers. And whereas the previous year there had been a lot of disruptive protests to panels that were Jewish themed, this year the organization took really great pains to sort of protect the Jewish voice. However, one of the most painful panels I attended, I did present some myself, but attended a panel that so perplexed me, by other Jews, on the weaponization of Jewish grief and the weaponization of Jewish history. I thought this is, I hadn't heard that term. I'm sure I was something of a straggler not having heard it, but it was quite wounding hearing that, knowing so many families that have lost people, um, who are living on the edge with family members still in captivity.
Yeah. There's a long tradition of Jewish poets responding to trauma, going back certainly to the temple. I think of Bialik after the Kishinev um, pogrom, writing in the City of Slaughter. And I noticed in your book you you reference Avraham Sutzkever,
Hmm.
Yiddish language poet, whose works chronicle childhood in Siberia, his life in Vilnius, and of course, being in the ghetto during World War II. Tell me a little bit about your connection to Sutzkever, and what did you hope to channel in invoking his name?
Well, I think he found me with at the beginning. He happens to be a poet I love. I think he's just a brilliant, brilliant poet. I don't speak Yiddish. I understand faultingly, so I sometimes have friends read me some of his poems in Yiddish just to appreciate the sonorities of them. But there's one poem in particular, it's an untitled poem, and it begins, "Who will last? What will last? A wind will last." And I had known this poem. It has some enigmas to it. Um, I could read some of it, but I began hearing this poem really within hours after October 7th. And what I felt so that's so meaningful is here's a poet who did survive, um, terrible anti-Semitism, and in fact managed to survive, um, immigrated eventually to Israel and continued to write in Yiddish, despite having very, very good Hebrew. And I thought this and then as so many Yiddish poets come from a culture where people were out to destroy them, and yet they found faith, they found hope, they found joy. So part of the resilience, um, for me was, here's a poet who's speaking to me. Now, I think he died 2010, but he lived quite, I think he was 101 something when he died. Um, but he was writing from another world where he found he found faith to go on, I think, through his writing, through his poetry. I mean, this poem, um, I'll read the first stanza. Who will last? What will last? A wind will last. The blind will die, their blindness last. The ocean's raveled foam will last. A cloud snagged by a tree will last. So I took those the first line, who will last, what will last, a wind will last, and that was the opening, the front piece, of the poem, because I felt like I owed something to this poem. And the very last poem, the very last line, well, I'll read the last two stanzas. Longer than all the northern stars will last, the star that falls in a tear will last. In the jug, a drop of wine will last. Who will last? What will last? God will last. Isn't that enough for you? As if he's already arguing about the existence and the continuity, and yet his poetry has lasted, and his poetry. So I use that the very last poem is called Sutzkever's last words. They were not his last words, but I quote the very end of that poem, and fragments of the poem appear throughout the book. Um, there's a whole poem to the wind. Where's the wind coming from? Is there a wind in heaven? Um, so there's a tradition of writers um, from times that were harder than our times. I mean, these are hard times, but there were times that were worse, and the artists somehow managed to give voice to something that I think helped so many people. So
Hmm.
he was an inspiration for me in this book. But I just when you say how did I find him, I felt like he found me. I started hearing those lines, and that really helped me so much in those first few days.
Wonderful. Um, I understand. I mean, I'm sure you've been writing your whole life, but as a published poet, it came to you somewhat later in life. Can you tell me a little bit about your journey from, I
Yeah.
guess, medical school to poetry?
Yes. Well, yeah, I wrote. Listen, when you're younger, you feel like you can do everything all at once. I wrote. I was a serious pianist. I was a student, and you know, I didn't. I always felt it was a calling to be a doctor. I felt writing was important. It was very important to me, even I would say more than music. But at a certain point, with a young family and career, I just lost myself in those two domains. And somewhere in my 50s, a number of things happened where I could reconsider um, parts of my life. Um, and I found myself writing again. And when I returned to it, so this would have been, say, maybe 20 years ago, less than 20 years ago. Um, I thought, okay, now it's time to really start writing. And I think I was writing as much from a sense of ego as anything else when I was younger. When I came back to it, I knew how to work. It was much easier when I was young to write another poem or wrote one novel, would write another, but I wouldn't know how to revise or work on anything. Um, and I learned how to work. And I had a number of teachers who were really quite important to me. Um, and I really dug in, and then I just kept at it, and then I made more and more time for it. And then professionally, at least in the medical side of things, um, uh, the work at Columbia under the leadership of Rita Sharon, the Department of Medical Humanities and Ethics, um, was formed in the medical school itself. And so I moved from being able to teach psychiatry to actually teach literature and writing um, to both medical students and trainees. I also teach at Montefiore Hospital. Um, so literature becomes a way of knowing yourself in a way that I think is very important for all doctors, but anyone in the helping professions um, um, can learn so much more about it, are freer to learn about an emotional situation when they don't have to perform a service, let's say. Um,
Mhm.
And so that becomes a very important role of literature in both connecting to oneself and connecting to others.
In this series, we've spoken to people. I'm thinking of your daughter using music as her kind of way of giving
Hmm.
back, probably no doubt dealing with her own grief. I've spoken to the Israeli writer Edgar Keret, who talked
Oh,
about
love him.
service. He talked
Love him.
about service. He said, I had to do. So he volunteered and he read to soldiers and he stood
Hmm.
in supplies. Tell me about the role of creativity for I wanted to talk about your return to poetry because I imagine a lot of our viewers are probably tempted to maybe either take pen to paper or put their fingers back on a keyboard or somehow. Is that a recommendation you have in your practice that you use your creativity, tap a new talent to kind of express maybe what might be inexpressible?
Um, Absolutely. I mean, follow your instincts. I mean, whether it's music, writing, painting, drawing. When I started writing again, I had no idea where it would lead me to. I just started because it felt important right then. And um, it brings you to parts of yourself that may not be able to be expressed in the day to day, may not have a place in one's friendships or relationships, but music and art and literature reach deeply, as does prayer for some people,
Mhm.
reaches deeply into a person and helps them realize themselves or realize parts of themselves that may not be apparent.
There's a poem I want to ask you. I want to ask you if you might read, which is Prospect Park Boathouse, Brooklyn.
Oh, sure.
And while you queue it up, I just want to remind people that you can drop questions in the chat. I see there are a few right now, which I'll try to get to, and put them in the chat, and I will ask as many as I can. And the reason I wanted to ask you to read this poem is because I think for two reasons. One, I was at the boathouse in Brooklyn, which
Hmm.
was just a few weeks ago, so it was very vivid for me. But I think it's going to speak to a kind of juxtaposition that has been very difficult for a lot of our viewers. So if you don't mind, if you could read that for us.
Um, so let me just mention the backstory of this. The son of a cousin of my wife's was getting married. They got married at the boathouse in Brooklyn. And here we were out in the open because it is an open air wedding. It's private, but just beyond that terrace in front of the boathouse, there's a bridge. And sure enough, I don't know how they sensed it, a group quickly gathered that hung. Well, you'll hear. I'll let the poem speak for itself.
Right.
Um, so it was this moment of, can we really be free and open, and what are the consequences?
As Jews, yeah.
Prospect Park, Boathouse, Brooklyn. We gather on the terrace beside a park pond. Early spring, too chilly for an outdoor wedding. The bride and groom stand beyond the weather. He's tall and angular, like a French partisan fighter or a Palmach soldier. Today, cast as a pacifist, besides his Botticelli bride, her golden brown hair luxurious. She might have arrived in her half shell to this Jewish wedding. The rabbi lifts his hands skyward. There, the clouds and overhanging trees. Our chuppah, amid familiar prayers, ancient vows. We make our home in the world, not in our rooms. On the arching bridge overhung with willows, placed on the left's perimeter, a painterly perspective, a pack of protesters. They all shout the same words, muffled in the distance, but the rhythms of chanting and clapping punctuate. They unfurl a banner, hang it from the bridge. Zionist Nazi genocide. Clap, 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 clap. Stomp, stomp, clap. We make our home in the world, not just in our rooms.
Hmm. And so it's a Jewish wedding, it's outdoors, the protest show
Disrupted,
up.
disrupted. And especially then I was it a year or two ago? Can't remember. But it felt like they're taking a risk. They want to be in the world. They don't want to hide.
Mhm.
And the rabbi who proclaimed the trees and the clouds their chuppah, they wanted to be out in the world and to be Jewish out in the world. And yet here was this very ugly disruption of an otherwise very beautiful wedding. And
I'm just really curious. I read this because it was so striking to me. They understood that they were kind of directing their ire at a Jewish wedding that
well,
happened to
they
take.
must have. I mean, there's a bride in a beautiful white dress. I mean, it doesn't take a genius to know you're looking at, a bride and a groom and they kiss and, everybody
Right.
claps. I mean, right?
Yeah, that's tragic. And really thank you for reading that. We have a recommendation from someone on the call says that I guess there's a literature emerging from October 7th.
Yes.
They recommend a bilingual English and Hebrew edition called Shiva,
Shiva, it's a wonderful book.
poems written on the heels of October 7th.
Yes.
I
It
know
it
you're familiar with it.
yes. I've read it cover to cover. It's wonderful. Um, and these are all Israeli poets. Another book I would recommend, this is a bilingual edition. There is an organization in Israel called the Association of Writers in English, and they put out a yearly journal. This year's journal was called ARC 31. I guess it's the 31st year it was put out. That is available on Amazon, ARC 31, and it contains many poems. Um, it's primarily Israeli writers, but who write specifically in English. Um, and Similar to Shiva, the anthology Shiva, ARC 31 has some crushingly beautiful poems in it.
Mhm. And our viewer says the collection they also mentioned is available on Amazon, and the
Yes.
proceeds go to a Israeli trauma collective. So that's useful. Um, Tell me about the power of poetry in terms of what are you able to do with a poem that you either can't do in prose, and I certainly can't do in writing an op-ed or an article. What is it about poetry that kind of frees you to express whatever pain, whatever delight, whatever feeling you're feeling?
Um, well, poetry is always a mix of both a narrative structure and an associative structure. So, whereas I mean, writing prose, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, may certainly take leaps. There's a kind of leap that's permissible in poetry that um, so that's number one. Poetry also works through a condensation, like unnecessary language is taken out. Um, Impactful language is heightened. So I recently read, I forget who said it, but uh, a poet who said, "My poetry's all lies." Well, it may be lies on one level, but it all works to create emotional truth. And, like a fiction writer, you wouldn't hold a fiction writer to necessarily have to tell the truth. Um, Even memoir writers stray somewhat sometimes and exaggerate, but I think it's the attempt to get at the emotion um, that's and highlight that emotion that's singular to poetry, and also in a world that's somewhat rushed and you know, I mean, we seem to become less efficient as we become more efficient. Um, Poetry can give, in a minute or two, not that you couldn't stay with the poem for an hour or two or more, but sometimes just reading something for a few minutes um, can give one something for the day to think about. Whereas, a story, a novel, you've got to give it a generous amount of time.
You mentioned kind of the shunning that went on in the artistic community, people taking sides, Israeli and Jewish writers being ostracized or invalidated, I guess is the
Mhm.
word of the day. Is there any bridge building, do you know, in the artistic community between Jewish writers, someone on the asked about Palestinian writers, any helpful signs that people want to, you know, reach across this terrible divide through the power of art or dialogue?
Um, yes, there's some. Um, I think there's some going on in Israel. Um, I know my daughter has played in ensembles that contain both Palestinian and Israeli musicians, and that's wonderful. They don't have to talk. I think not as much because for the moment, there is some, I think it's not going on across the board. I think Palestinian poets, and I had a piece published in the LA Times on the power of listening to one another, and I write about a number of Palestinian poets who are gorgeous and compelling, but I think they're sort of caught because if they are too understanding, too solicitous, um, they may be seen as sellouts or
Mhm.
not being true and to their own people. So I think it's unfortunate. I think it will happen. Um, I think if artists can't listen to one another, how do we expect statesmen to listen to one another?
Mhm.
I think artists can and should lead the way. I don't think it's happening enough.
There's a few recommendations in our for these kinds of
Good.
efforts in the chat. Some people talk about the Jerusalem Youth Chorus,
Yeah.
um, but the ones that don't live in Jerusalem, of course, have a hard time attending. And there is probably a little bit more, maybe a little bit more dialogue on the ground. But again, I think you're right that a lot of that has to happen a little bit on the down low because
Hmm.
it can be dangerous for Palestinians
Yes.
I think they call it normalization,
Hmm.
unfortunately. Um, in reading I was thinking when I was in reading your book that there's a number of poets who we talked about the Jewish poets, but there were two poets that I thought of who are also dealt with trauma. One was W.H. Auden,
Hmm.
famous poem called September 1st, 1939, outbreak of World War One. And then there was one written 9/11 uh, appeared in the New Yorker, I think, soon after the attacks by Adam Zagajewski.
Oh,
Try to
the
praise
Polish
the
poet.
try to praise the mutilated world.
Right.
And
I know that's such a what a killer line that is.
that's
Try
what
to
I thought.
praise me. Right.
You must praise the mutilated world. And then I didn't want to go without mentioning Yehuda Amichai, the great Hebrew language Israeli poet. and he often dealt very gently with very difficult topics. And I was thinking of The Diameter of the Bomb.
Oh my God. That's one of my favorite poems.
It's very short. Can you indulge me? Can I read a few snippets of this?
Yes, please. No, it's a poem that should be heard. And then I want to say something about
Good,
the ending of it. But go
good,
ahead.
good. So is this three? I think it's a short poem. Um, the diameter of the bomb was 30 centimeters, and the diameter of its effect was 7 meters, with 4 dead and 11 wounded. And around them, in a radius of several hundred meters, are broken windows and the cries of the wounded, 1,000 shouts, and 1,000 doors knocked open. And that's just a snippet, but
Well, no, we keep reading because
that's what that's all I wrote down because I didn't want to
oh,
forget about it.
okay.
But like, tell me about
So let me see if I can oh, you don't have let me
no, I
find.
don't have the full thing in front of me, but I can call it up. But again,
Okay.
he's expanding the blast. Someone called it the
Okay.
blast
So
radius into
okay. So it continues
the wonders of Google. This is great that we can actually call this
no,
up.
no, I actually have it because I read it.
Yeah,
I read it. Um, I don't recall the last line that you read it. Maybe it's a different version.
right.
Round these in a larger circle of pain and time, two hospitals are scattered in one graveyard. But the young woman who was buried in the city she came from at a distance of more than 100 kilometers enlarges the circle considerably. And the solitary man mourning her death at a distant shore of a country far across the sea includes the entire world in the circle. And I won't even mention the crying of orphans that reach up to the throne of God and beyond, making a circle with no end and no God.
Hmm.
But here's the thing, the ending is almost untranslatable because in Hebrew, it's et hama'agal le'ein sof ve'ein Elohim. And the interest, so it's literally saying the circle with no end and no God, but Ein Sof, which means no end, in a certain tradition is also the name of God, the Ein Sof. So embedded in this, in English, we say a circle with no end and no God. It's a circle with no end, which is God, and no God. So he manages to brilliantly put God into the equation, which reminds me, of the Sutskever poem, God will last. Isn't that enough for you? I mean, he's a little blunter than Amakai is here in this poem. But thank you for, um,
I couldn't resist only
no, it's
because
wonderful, wonderful that you,
it's funny when you talk about the posters on the Upper West Side. It's hard, I think, maybe if you don't have that connection to, I'm not going to just say the connection to Israel. You don't have a connection to the 7 million Jewish people who live in Israel because it's a familial connection. Maybe people don't understand those ripples that, all right, what are you so upset about? This happened in a faraway land, that in a foreign country, in two foreign countries, but what are you on the Upper West Side or in Shaker Heights or in Los Angeles, Pico? What are you so upset about? And I think that's what many of your poems capture. That's the sense of ripples that Amichai is talking about.
um, well, yes, I mean, and because, for me, there's one, let me see if I can find this poem. Um, because at a certain point, they're all your children, they're all your cousins, um, they're all your relations. I have one poem, and I think this captures it. generation to generation, Lador Vador. More Noahs on the wall of glass, almost all 240 hostages. Their faces survive the night. The thickest tape affixes them to the glass. Well, anyway, it goes on, and then I say they're all Noah. Noah Shani and Noah Shachar and Noah Gali and Noah Aden, Noah Chana. My Noah would make six. How will we put these faces together again? These ripped paper faces on the sidewalk. They were
Mhm.
very real, each one of them. These were pieces of people that when
Yeah.
I walked to Zabar's, I would walk across pieces of the posters of the hostages. Um,
I know so many of our viewers are looking for some solace, for some tools, for some way of coping with their own grief. And I just, if you could, and as we move towards the end, if we could talk a little bit about what do you tell people now who say, listen, those people who say, I can't talk about Israel, I can't not talk about Israel. How do you tell people how do you help people deal with the kind of day-to-day grind of difficult news, whether it's in Israel or it's here in the United States?
well, for me, reading Sutskever, I mean, as dark as these times are, and they're pretty dark. I mean, it's not just what's going on between Israel and Gaza. Um, I mean, there are many genocides going on in, in the world. The genocide in Darfur is continuing. Um, there's so many places where starvation is going on. Um, and yet we have to imagine a better world and do what we can, each in our own way, and turn off the TVs and don't read the newspapers when it becomes too much.
Hmm.
Because I feel like the most important thing for everyone to do is to keep up their spirit and to maintain some sense of optimistic possibility. Um, so, I mean, there were many wonderful examples, even in concentration camps, of what people did to keep up their dignity, right, for a better time. And the survival of a Sutskever for me. Um, I have another poem about Gideon Klein, who was a composer, died at, I think, 23. Um, he completed his last trio in Theresen before he went off to Auschwitz. It's a trio my daughter's played a number of times and champions. When something survives, we survive and our spirits survive. And I think
That's powerful. Thank you.
ending to that. Yeah.
Someone writes, referring to your previously when you're talking about the posters, they write, that is a painful experience, and I'm glad that you were able to write about it as poetry. And I think we could say that all of us on this call are glad that you were able to write about your experience as poetry, and to help the rest of us, both as readers and maybe some writers who will take pen to paper as a way to find solace in a really difficult time. So I want to thank you, Dr. Lewis, for um, your book, which is called A Prayer of Six Wings. And I want to thank our partners, the UJA-Federation of New York, My Jewish Learning, and Kveller. And I also want to thank two people behind the scenes here who make all this work, and that's Thea Wieseltier and Becky Phillips at 70 Faces. Dr. Lewis, thank you again. I hope people read the
Thank you
book.
so much.
Thank you so much for writing it.
Thank you for having me.
And I'll say goodnight to all. Thank you very much.